states. The same issue is happening in Georgia, and right now the Secretary of State and the governor are saying that they're throwing their hands up in the air and saying they can't do anything.
Well, I'd like to add that it's not just in the South. Reports here in New York City and New York State in the past few days indicate that election officials don't have enough people assigned for Election Day for the expected surge of voters, and they're looking at a possible major problem here in terms of huge lines on Election Day here in New York State. It just seems to be almost that the country got used to the fact that about 50% of the population was actually voting in elections, and if it gets up to 60 or 70%, there seems to be almost like a meltdown in the system's ability to be able to handle that many voters.
It is, and you do see it across the country. We focus on the South, obviously, and I think there's a unique history of how this affects voters in the South. Clearly, I think all the research suggests that when you have these long lines, the impact of disenfranchisement is especially hard on working families, African-American voters, Latino voters, and I think that's why you especially see, for example, the Obama campaign is particularly concerned about the impact this could have in a close swing state like Florida or Virginia, where you know that it's going to be decided by, it could be tens of thousands of votes. Of course, in 2000, decided by 530, just over 500 votes. So this is the sort of thing that could have a very big impact. And it does get to a bigger issue that the United States tries to position itself across the world as a beacon of democracy. But historically, elections are very underfunded. And you find out every election season that our election system is actually fairly fragile. And all it takes is a little glitch, and you suddenly find out problems that are the sort of thing that could sway an election.
Chris Kromm, talk about your own state. Talk about North Carolina. Very close. What are you seeing right now? Obama was just there. You're speaking to us from Raleigh.
That's right. One of the closest states in the country we produce that's facing south. If you want to go to our website, we call it the Southern Swingability Index. What are the tightest states? And North Carolina is clearly going to be one of the closest states in the country this year. It's less than 2 percentage points between Barack Obama and John McCain. And that's where you find issues like voting glitches. Well, another issue we have in our state is an issue where the ballot has a somewhat confusing design. Where when you vote straight ticket in our state, it doesn't include the vote for president. You have to vote for president separately. And what that ends up doing is confusing a lot of voters, especially first-time voters. And so, of course, this year you see this major turnout, skyrocketing of new registrations and new voter turnout. It's these voters who are most vulnerable to being confused by this ballot. And what it leads to is what's called undervotes. People who submit a ballot, they go to the polls on Election Day, but then they don't register a vote for president because they get tricked up by the presidential race being separate from the straight ticket voting. And you're already hearing these anecdotal stories of people coming out of the polls crying. The whole reason they came out, it's like, I came out to vote for president today, and I just found out that I missed ticking that box. Now, the state, to its credit, is doing a great job trying to educate voters about this. A lot of nonprofit groups are doing the same thing. But by our estimates, in 2004, upwards of 50, 60, maybe even 70,000 voters didn't register a vote for president because of this confusion with the ballot. And again, so that's the sort of thing in a tight race that could determine the outcome of an election.
And you mentioned that North Carolina is so close. Why? Since it's been so reliably a Republican state in presidential elections for decades now, what's been the change that has made it possible for North Carolina, places like Virginia, and obviously Florida to be so much in play?
Well, I think overall, the direction of the South really is changing. I think a lot of the people who look at the South and kind of write it off as being a place that's not going to be in play really aren't paying attention to the way the demographics of the region are changing, the growth of urban areas, the changing racial makeup of the South. It's just becoming a different region. You especially see this in places like Virginia and North Carolina. Florida, of course, has its own dynamic. And these states, I think, every year are going to see them become becoming more battlegrounds just because of the way they're changing. And especially this year, I think what you're seeing is kind of a perfect storm of factors. On one hand, you have a candidate like Barack Obama who is just inspiring the base in this state of Democratic voters like no other candidate has in decades. In this state, we've had 1.6 million early voters already turning out to the polls, a record turnout. 28% of those are African-American voters. It's this surge of voters at the base of the Democratic Party, and I think only a candidate like Barack Obama really could have mobilized the base in that way. On the other hand, you have a candidate like John McCain, who I think in a way has demobilized his base because you have Christian conservatives who don't identify with him as much, so you don't have that base as activated. You add on top of that issues like the economy. The North Carolina economy has been devastated this year. Two of our biggest and growing sectors are manufacturing and finance. Two sectors that have been absolutely hammered this year. Unemployment is skyrocketing. It's about to go over 8%, one of the hardest hit countries in the states in the country. And that is really pushing, especially one of the most interesting polls I found is white moderate voters in the mountains who were so disillusioned with the direction of the economy that you started seeing them gravitating towards Barack Obama for president. And I think it's this perfect storm of factors. And then you add on things like we're the only state in the South that has same-day voter registration, which means today, if you haven't registered to vote yet, you can still go and register and cast your vote at the same time in North Carolina. And that's the sort of thing that's going to bring out lots of voters.
Unemployment in North Carolina and in early voting, how many African Americans have come out? How many young people have come out? Do you think the numbers are going to be as overwhelming as has been predicted?
Well, right now it's on course to be that way, and we don't know how much early voting is going to measure up with what happens at the end of the day. But if that is any indication, there have been 1.6 million early voters. That's eclipsed. We eclipsed the 2004 early voting within the first few days in this state. 28% of those have been African American voters, when the percentage of the population that's African American is 20%. So a hugely, a big disproportionate surge in the African American vote in this state. A third of those voters have been under 45. So again, a surge in this youth vote. And that was a real critical issue, too, because people were saying that Barack Obama was banking on this youth vote, but would they really turn out? Historically, that's been a base, a voting base that has been ruled up for question whether or not they'll actually turn out on Election Day. So far, the evidence is with early voting in North Carolina, they are turning out. So we'll see how that measures up to the final tally on Election Day, but I promise you it's going to be one of the closest states in the country.
Not since Jimmy Carter has North Carolina voted for a Democratic presidential candidate.
That's absolutely right. And there's some speculation that the 1992 election with Bill Clinton, it wasn't actually that close, but it was close enough that people speculate whether issues like the confusing ballot, because there were so many undervotes in that race where the president didn't get counted, whether that's something that could have made a difference.
Chris Kromm, thanks so much for being with us. We'll link to your website at ours. He's director of Institute for Southern Studies. Again, on Election Day, we'll do a 5-hour special starting 7:00 p.m. Eastern Time. The next morning, 2 hours the morning after. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. This is Democracy Now!